Hello, folks. Welcome to a new week on World War II TV. And although the Battle of the Bulge had more or less culminated by early February 1945, so 80 years ago, we returned to the battle to look at the role of 4th Armour defending the Bastogne corridor. And we're welcoming back Don Fox on his whatever experience it is he's been on. I can't remember how many he's done now. Good afternoon, Don. How are you today?
Good afternoon, Paul. It's great to be with you today.
So we were just talking before going live about the 1945 in many ways being the forgotten year of the war. And as soon as the Battle of the Bulge even kind of begins to look like it's wrapped up, attention just kind of drifts away from it. Once the link-ups happen, once the airdrops have come in, is it frustrating that we stop showing interest before it gets really interesting, arguably?
It is very frustrating. So many times I think people conclude the battle, storytellers conclude it as of the relief of Bastogne on December 26th. And I was like, well, that's it. And by the way, nothing should have been assumed at that point. Not that the Germans could have won the battle per se in totality at the Bulge, but in terms of coming to a resolution on the campaign, it was so far from over. And the heaviest fighting in the entire battle all occurred after December 26th, and it deserves a lot more attention. Even when I was writing the first volume of my history of the Fourth and doing my own research, one of my favorite stories of the Fourth's campaign during the Bulge is what we're going to talk about today, and what ultimately happened right in the last 2 days of December. It's a great story.
And as we will find out, that switching from a sort of a defensive role, although not all units had a defensive role in the first unit, but switching from a defensive role to an offensive role is quite awkward. And the Germans having to make that decision of switching from an offensive role to a defensive role. And it's not exactly clear where both sides in different parts of the battlefield kind of make that switch. It's my kind of evolution rather than revolution. I think that's why that period of transition is really interesting, because you can't kind of put your finger on an hour on a day and say, well, from that moment onward, the Americans are on the offensive and the Germans on the defensive. It just, like all cool things in history, it's never that neat. But anyway, over to you, Don. I'll just remind people, folks, that the links to Don's books are in the description below, and Facebook page where there's loads more photos. But I'm going to hand over to my guest now to talk about this important battle that we've just built up rather well, I think.
Terrific. Yes. Thanks, Paul. And I want to start with a little bit more of I'll call it a prologue, so that people listening in can understand the context for what's going to happen. And, with the 4th Armored Division, as I'm going to assume a lot of your listeners are going to be aware, there's 3 combat commands: Combat Command B, Combat Command A, and Combat Command Reserve. I'll just call it CCR. And I've listed them on that order on the slide because that is the way they were arrayed at the start of the counterattack from west to east. A fact a lot of people aren't aware of is that Combat Command B was in the Ardennes before the balance of the division arrived first, and actually sent a task force into Bastogne on December 19th, 20th. The 19th is when they arrived, the 20th. The morning of the 20th, they went into the town with a company of tanks, company of armored infantry, and a battery of self-propelled artillery. A little known fact I thought I'd mention. If the veterans were still around, they'd appreciate the nod. So you had Combat Command B arranged to the west. Combat Command A was in the center and advancing up the main artery leading to Bastogne. That's Highway N4, which is the highway that runs from Arlon to Bastogne. The highest quality road probably in the entire Ardennes, perhaps even still today. I think back then, definitely. Normally would have been about to go from Mar-de-Lange on the Shore River to Bastogne, a matter of 10 minutes to drive it on a nice sunny day with no ice on the road. Mm. And then you had Combat Command Reserve, was operating farther to the east. Originally wasn't intended to be deployed in a direct attack at the outset. So I'm going to pull up a map, and the this map, little bit small fonts and so on. But this is from the official Army volume by UCOL. And again, this is what a lot of people think of on this map. And you can see this shows the axis of movements for the combat commands up to December 26th, really, at the point of the breakthrough. And so I want to go back. I want to talk about Combat Command B a little bit. Again, it was arraigned to the west after it had entered Bastogne, was actually pulled back. This is one of the, again, fascinating stories of the war. You have an entire combat command positioned in bivouac south of Bastogne that would have been potentially, if left in place, in the exact spot that the 26th Volksgrenadier Division and elements of Panzer Lehr were encircling Bastogne from the south. A lot of speculation, but perhaps if they had never been pulled back to join the rest of the division for the initiation of the attack scheduled for December 22nd, the Germans may have never encircled Bastogne to the south. One of the most intriguing what-ifs of the entire campaign. But the way it turned out, CCB was pulled back, reassembled west of Arlon, and then attacked starting December 22nd on secondary roads, famously led through the village of Chaumont, were subjected to a intense German counterattack on the 23rd, had to pull back, spend a day regrouping before starting up its attack anew. In the meantime, CCA had been trying to drive up the Arlon-Bastogne highway. Definitely, of the three combat commands, even with the fact, considering the fact that CCB was repulsed at Chaumont, CCA faced the toughest resistance, the toughest geography. We'll talk as we get towards December 30th or 31st, the most difficult terrain, in the Bastogne sector. Once you move west of the Arlon-Bastogne highway, it gets a lot friendlier in terms of open, sweeping plains. There are some forest patches and so on, but it's nothing like what is to the east of the Arlon-Bastogne highway, especially the farther east that you go. And then Combat Command Reserve was actually put into the line after the initiation of the rest of the attacks, because there was some reports of German activity near Pearl and more importantly, the town of Bougainville. And there simply weren't other forces in place to protect the flank of the division. So CCR, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, 37th Tank Battalion, famously assigned to CCR at that point, and they were given the task of moving through clearing Bougainville. It was about a battalion of German paratroopers there from the 5th Volksscharger Division. Intense fighting there, clean that out. And then on Christmas Eve, they were ordered to circle all the way back around to the west, famously to then pick up the attack towards Bastogne generally on the axis of the Neufchâteau Bastogne highway. So all these things are fairly well known. I've just added to that, recounting the history. It's what most people are familiar with. It leads up to the breakthrough to Bastogne on the 26th by the Combat Command Reserve and Creighton Abrams. And I'll give a nod to the battalion commander, George Jacques of the 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion. A lot of times he's forgotten in that entire story. So after the relief, so it's the night of December 26th, the corridor, very narrow corridor, just going up this dirt road leading from Azincourt to Bastogne. Now that's got to be widened. And it fell predominantly on the 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion to push into the woods east of that road. Very heavy fighting. The Germans were still very motivated to defend that and to try to close it. They didn't have any tank forces in the area. It was strictly up to the infantry. But the 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion managed to push them deeper into the woods, cleared the way, and then ambulances, vehicles were able to start to pass, and the evacuation started out of Bastogne. On December 27th, CCB kept moving forward. The 10th Armored Infantry Battalion, the 8th Tank Battalion, over predominantly open ground that was to the east-southeast of those woods that lined the Bastogne-Azumois road. Not a substantially large forested area, but enough to provide cover. And the Germans there were pinched out. They were pinched out by the 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion, pushing deeper to the east, moving the corridor into the woods, and then the 10th AIB and the 8th Tank Battalion pushing up from the south and squeezing the Germans out like toothpaste from a tube and pushing them to the east. So the Germans are compressed to the east. And then you have Combat Command A, which has not closed the gap with Combat Command B, still fighting its way up the Arlon-Bastogne Highway, N4. And all the way up to December 28th, it's still not closed. They finally, near the, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, Remesfa, on the Arlon-Bastogne Highway.
I can help with the Normandy ones, but I can't help with the Bastogne ones.
Yes, yeah. So it's this largest small village south of Bastogne, straddles the Arlon-Bastogne Highway. That's the last little village that CCA has to clear, and from there it's open. I mean, it's open field and terrain all the way up to where the 101st Airborne perimeter would be. And as they're approaching, there's a farmhouse that they see up that the tankers from the 35th Tank Battalion with CCA see ahead of them, and they put that structure under fire. Hundreds of rounds poured into it, and it turns out that's one of the command posts of the 101st. Fortunately, no casualties. But that even speaks to some of the fog of war. Even though one of the key missions of the key events that happened, both when Combat Command Reserve made contact with the 101st, and then even when CCB made contact, there was an exchange of maps, situation maps, so that presumably everyone in the 4th Armored would be aware of all the defensive positions held by the 101st on the perimeter. So to precisely avoid this type of friendly fire accident. But despite having the maps and the exchange of information, that still happened, and it was just very fortunate that it was without casualty. So at that point, now the Arlon-Bastogne Highway is open. That in fact, that's where when General Patton first went into Bastogne, a lot of photographs of that, him riding up in his Jeep with the 50 cal mounted in the back of it. That was the Arlon-Bastogne Highway that he took to get there, and then awarded McAuliffe, and a lot of people familiar with all those visuals. So at that point, though, the 4th, contact is made, they begin to turn to the east, not to continue the attack at that point, strictly to move over to a defensive position, like you talked about. Like when does that happen? Well, for the 4th, it was at that point on the 29th. So they start to pivot. And now you've got, to their left is CCB, but there are no more German forces between them. They've all been squeezed out of the toothpaste tube. Everything's to the east. So Combat Command Reserve, they're still protecting the left side of the corridor. There are forces on the way. The 11th Armored Division, the 87th Infantry Division. These are all, these two divisions in particular, have been preparing to move into the zone and pick up everything on the west side of the corridor. Combat Command B, sort of in the middle of all this, they're completely in the clear. So they move into a little bit more of a reserve status at first, and then are on alert to respond to any activity, any problems that might happen to either side. But predominantly at that point, they're thinking about, the Americans are thinking about what could be happening to the east side of the corridor. Now, just below the 4th Armored is the 35th Infantry Division. has been inserted into the line. And I don't know if, Paul, I don't know if you see you probably don't see my cursor when I move on this.
No, we can't see your coast. No.
Yeah,
no,
okay. So south of Bastogne is a very heavily wooded area. In the center of it is a small little, it's hard to even call it a village, Losange, Losange, and there's a chateau there. And really, that's the primary feature there. There's a couple of other buildings near the road, but the Chateau de Losange is the main feature, and it's closer to the edge of those woods. But that entire area, very, very densely wooded, still is today. And then there's Villers-au-Banu is another village farther to the east. So the 35th Infantry Division is brought up by Third Army, and it's inserted between the 4th Armored and the 26th Infantry Division. Up to this point, you've had, so I'll back up a little bit, you've had 3 corps, the U.S. 3rd Corps has been responsible for Patton's counteroffensive. 4th Armored Division to the left in the west, then the 26th Infantry Division and the 80th Infantry Division. So they're aligned that way from west to east. By the way, the 26th Infantry Division and the 80th Infantry Division having the worst terrain to fight through. In fact, I believe it was the historian MacDonald who, in Time for Trumpets, said, I'm going to paraphrase, whoever picked that area for the battle had a taste for shit.
Yeah. But it says exactly what it does. Yeah.
Yes, and especially because the axis of attack was totally counter to the terrain channels, and it was difficult. So the 26th and 80th have been gone through days. They've been through more than a week of heavy fighting. The 4th Armored had pushed beyond them to the north, and a gap had opened there, and so the 35th was used to then plug that gap between the 4th Armored and the 26th Infantry Division. Not just plug the gap, though. They, even while the 4th Armored had stopped, the 35th Infantry Division had the mission to continue the attack. So in essence, to continue to broaden the corridor to the east. The right unit to do it, because again, the terrain is very poor here. It wasn't terrain for armored action. So they draw the assignment. They're pushing north. And the Germans are ready to heavily contest this. Through all that wooded area, the 5th Parachute Division, German Parachute Division in particular, it was in that area. And while the 5th had been in the battle from day one, and I always found interesting, was always kind of knocked, degraded by their peers, the other divisions. But when I talk about the 1st SS Panzer Division, they were no leadership there, were no fans of the 5th. They were outwardly blamed them. In fact, I'm getting ahead of myself, but blamed them for some of the lack of success the 1st had in the coming days. But at least on the part of the 4th Armored, they highly respected the 5th as opponents once they got in there and had to do battle with them over all that time. So, but now it's the 35th Infantry Division that has to take them on. And they're advancing deep into these woods, trying to expand it. So we move up to on the eve of December 30th. And actually, I'll back up a little bit more. On December, let me move this slide. We're going to talk a lot about the 1st SS Panzer Division. And I have to back up, though, because, and this is one I find to be one of the most interesting elements of this, or just how the story plays out. Probably everybody listening is aware of the role of the 1st SS Panzer Division with Kampfgruppe and then the Malmedy Massacre. What some people may not know is that within the 1st Panzer, the 7th Panzer Company, which is part of the 2nd Battalion of the 1st SS Panzer Division, it's the Mark IV Panzers, not the Panthers. That's in the 1st Battalion. The 2nd Battalion is all the Mark IVs. It was the 7th Panzer Company that was the lead element that first encountered the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, which was the main unit that was ambushed right? They're moving to support the 7th Armored Division, just moving on that road from Malmedy south. It's just a crossing of that German armor column moving across this almost rear area column of the Americans coming through. When the 7th Panzer Company first encountered the unit, it's a combat situation just like any other, and they put the column under fire, and it was the elements of the 7th Company that did that. And this is, I don't intend the conversation today to be a recounting of the Malmedy Massacre. Lots of books written about it. I guess I'll give some free advertising to one that Fatal Crossroads by Danny Parker. I think that's a good, more contemporary accounting of it. And he writes about the role of some of the individuals of the 7th Company. But over the course of the hours, there's various scenarios. I find when we, I'll show you another book that is, I don't know if you're going to screenshot, Paul. The 7th, it's a history of the 7th Panzer Company, and it's written by one of the veterans of the division. And I highly recommend it for anybody interested in either of these elements. Of course, a lot of the history is so much about the earlier part of the Bulge, but in this history, you get it has just detailed personal accounts from members of that 7th Company, not just about what happened in Malmedy and those areas, but when we get to what happened on December 30th. So after Malmedy, we know the history of the 1st. They are then ordered earlier than maybe a lot of people think, December 25th, to move to Bastogne. Now, the 1st SS, they're minus Kampfgruppe Peiper, obviously, and they're severely weakened. The reconnaissance battalion was almost wiped out, the 1st Panzer Battalion, but the 2 Panzer Grenadier regiments were still in pretty good shape. And much of the 2nd Battalion, the Panzer IVs, were relatively intact. So they still had, by accounts, maybe about 4 dozen Panzers, mostly Mark IVs. Plus, you still had Tiger II, Tiger Bs of the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion, Tiger Battalion, which was attached to the 1st SS. So when this division is ordered to move to Bastogne, the 501st is still attached to them. And here were the orders. This is from General Field Marshal von Rundstedt. This is a direct language from it. It is of decisive importance that the enemy attack wedge in the area of Bastogne is smashed very quickly and with sufficient and sweeping forces and means. That wedge, that is the 4th Armored Division, the attack wedge that relieved it. Second point was, for this, I am in agreement that the 1st SS Panzer Division is to be quickly led into the area of Bastogne in order to add force to a concentrated attack of the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division and the 167th Volksgrenadier Division against the deep flanks of the American units. The units of the 1st SS Panzer Division are to apply their forces in local strong points where necessary. They couldn't move immediately. There were air power, as you remember, the weather had cleared. The Jabots were out in force, ready to stop any daytime movement of German columns. So at that point, they were restricted to nighttime movement. So the 1st SS was relieved. They were actually off the line already, but they had assembled in the Stavelot Point area. Actually had some elements to the west of St. Vith, some to the east of St. Vith. They hadn't totally consolidated yet. They were, and I have the note here as far as the tank strength, the 7th Company had 7 to 10 Mark IVs. Accounts from the members of the unit itself vary on this, and it's almost impossible to get a precise count. But 7 to 10 Mark IVs for the 7th Company. And then the 6th Panzer Company had 6 to 8. I would say from everything I've read, those numbers, the numbers skew towards the higher end of those 2 ranges. I'm more inclined to think it was about 10 Mark IVs for the 7th and 8 Mark IVs for the 6th. The 167th Volksgrenadier Division, by the way, who was going to fight alongside the 1st SS Panzer Division, was in very good shape. Well-equipped, fresh troops. They had come from the Eastern Front. They had not been engaged yet on the Western Front. So they had gone through some reorganization and were in pretty solid shape. Now, those units, predominantly the 167th Division, the Volksgrenadier Division, the 1st SS Panzer, elements of the 5th Parachute Division that were still on the eastern side of the corridor, and presumably some elements of Panzer Lehr were supposed to participate, but there seems to be no evidence that they actually complied with that or were able to get in position. So it's predominantly the 167th, 1st SS, elements of the 5th Parachute that attacked the corridor from the east. The 1st SS arranged their forces into 2 battle groups. Kampfgruppe Poschke, which was remains of the SS Panzer Regiment, predominantly the 6th and the 7th Panzer Companies, plus they had, I thought this was always interesting to know, plus 1 Panther. So they mixed the Panther in with the Mark IVs. And then you had the 2nd Battalion of the 1st Panzer Grenadier Regiment of the 1st SS and the 1st Battalion of the 2nd Regiment. The balance of the division comprised Kampfgruppe Hansen. And that was the so the balance of the 1st and the 2nd Regiments, the reconnaissance platoon that remained from the reconnaissance battalion, and a company of engineers. And you had about 7 or 8 Mark VI King Royal Tigers attached to it. So what were they going to do? This is a satellite view of the area, and the red arrow to the left, that is the attack route that Kampfgruppe Poschke with the Panzers, with the 2 companies of Mark IVs was going to take. The assembly area was near Watrange, right where you can see Kampfgruppe Poschke is labeled. Both Kampfgruppes assembled in that general area. The objective was to advance. You can see the advance route goes in between 2 wooded areas. The village of Luchereau is closer to the edge of the forest that's to the left. And by the way, people can see on the map, you can see Highway N4 and how that runs down the west side. So that tank-heavy force was to drive through that opening between the 2 batches of forest, capture Luchereau, which was in American hands. The 35th Infantry Division had occupied Luchereau the day prior, so they were barely dug into those positions, and then continue through, cut across the N4 highway, and then continue driving west to link up with a whole other array of German forces that were attacking the corridor from the west. So this attack was intended to sever the corridor from both sides, and the meeting point was going to be that wooded area to the east of Azumois that I talked about before, that the 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion. And
this is what we were saying earlier, Don, about this refocusing of ideas, so to speak, in that people are already starting to, December the 26th, that's when you talk about von Rundstedt, that's the date that we all say, well, that was Bastogne relieved, therefore end of battle, let's go and do something else. And while the Germans are maybe now no longer pushing towards Antwerp, but they have refocused. They're thinking about what now can we do? We're not going to just give up immediately. The Germans have learned from the Eastern Front is that when you're pushed back, when your first plan doesn't work, pull out a second plan and a third plan and a fourth plan, and you evolve and you develop counterattacks, and that's why it took the Soviets 2 years to push them out of Soviets. So already there are people watching this, I'm sure, who are thinking, I didn't know this stuff was happening, because we're into that. But Bastogne has been relieved.
Yeah,
Saint-Vith has happened.
And to take a step back for a moment, think at this point, it's pretty much a foregone conclusion that the Meuse River is out of reach. There, yeah. But now you've got this 65-mile deep salient.
Yeah.
And which, by the way, it's just the nature of warfare. That outer perimeter is occupying the attention of a disproportionate number of Allied troops, including, by the way, part of the 8th Army that's brought down. You've got the British 6th Parachute Division, the 53rd. You've got the Guards Armored Division. These are you've got elements from the U.S. 9th Army that have been brought down. You got the 2nd Armored Division. All of these forces are otherwise being used to begin attacks into Germany. So to the extent that the German command, Hitler or anyone else, feels that time is of value, and a valued commodity for them, it makes some sense to try to hold on to this salient. And have the Americans defending it. And now, by the way, as you switch to the defensive of defending that salient, the Germans also have the advantage of being on interior lines. But to do that, what's the problem? What's the flying in the ointment, even to be able to execute a traditional salient defense on interior lines? Well, you got this Bastogne problem. And you got this penetration right to it, which in that area, the Germans have, the Americans still have the advantage of being on interior defensive lines. Within the salient. So yes, these two conflicting things. And now you end up, in essence, too, with both sides simultaneously on the offensive. You can't even, especially on the west side of the corridor, because now you've got that same day, December 30th, that we'll talk about in a moment, when the Germans launched the attack from both sides. The 11th Armored Division in particular is launching, it's going into on the offensive for the first time on the west side, full-blown offensive. And those two attacks collide head on the west side. And the Germans weren't able to penetrate successfully to the east, but boy, I'll tell you, there were tremendously heavy losses. It was a very difficult christening in battle for the 11th Armored Division. On the going back to the east side, again, you see the two columns. They were going to cross N4, link up with those German forces attacking from the west that I just mentioned. Now, just to the north of that, the top red arrow is where the 167th Volksgrenadier Division was deployed. Their assembly area was primarily in that heavy forested area that's in the center to the right part of the map. Their attack was going to be to deploy in column formation 2 battalions. It really wasn't tremendously well conceived, especially as it had to break out over open terrain. So I'll just talk about their experience quickly because it's a short story. They advance in columns of battalions heading out across that area, and American artillery just about took care of the rest. So they did advance as far as the highway, but they were just cut to pieces and had to retreat and pull back. And the cut to pieces term, I think that's pretty much a direct quote of the division commander later on. So it was disastrous for them trying to be deployed in that way. For the first SS, the Kampfgruppe in particular, as they started to advance towards Luchereau, they came under fire because the Americans occupied the edge of that wood line that's south and west of Luchereau. And occupied the village itself. But the Panzer Grenadiers that came through with some armored support in some very heavy fighting did seize and secure Luchereau, and then the rest of the Panzers continued. Now, during that early fighting, elements of the 35th took out perhaps 6 or 7 of the Mark IVs, some anti-tank guns, that were in the area. And I've never read anything, only about anti-tank guns, nothing about any armored support that was available at that point to the 35th in that area. But the 35th, the infantry elements were pushed back into the wood line. And so the 6th and 7th Panzer Company continued advancing over that open ground along that axis of advance that you see. And generally towards the direction of Bremerfoss. The Americans had already, the 4th Armored Division had been alerted about this attack. And one thing that was very pivotal, there was a Cub plane flown by Lieutenant Pearson, an artillery observer for the 4th. And the German participants in the memoir of the tank company, they talk about this plane and how close it flew, and they could throw rocks at it. But they knew as soon as that plane was over that they had a problem. And what Pearson did is he spotted the German columns, and he wrote his observation notes on paper and inserted it in a canister of some sort, and then flew back towards N4 where the 4th Armored Position was, and dropped it out of his plane. So no radio, nothing. Just dropped it. They read it, and they were on alert about what was coming. Now, the 35th Tank Battalion was the part of Combat Command A that was guarding that zone, and they had suffered a lot of losses of their own all the way during the drive to Bastogne. So B Company, which was commanded by Lieutenant John Kingsley, had 6 Shermans, and that was it. To the best of my knowledge, they were all 35 or 75 millimeter Shermans. He didn't have any of the 76s. And he selected an excellent defilade position. When you go out there today, I've been to the site. It's the most modest of hills, just to the east of the highway. Just enough to get in perfect position to go into a hold down position. And he waited. And the 6th Panzer Company arrived first. And the 6th Panzer Company happened to notice some Shermans of one of the other tank companies from the 35th operating farther to the north. And then they received instructions, rather than sort of cutting due west, they went more to the north, and they got instructions to turn north and head more towards the direction of Marvy. They turned, that exposed their left flank to Kingsley's ambush position. And you just, the way it works, you're in whole defilade, you're just able to, you just pull up, your gun barrel's right over the crest of the hill, all that's exposed is the top of the turret. You've got a tank commander ride with his binoculars up a little higher to see and spot it. Actually, the tank commander will be observing first before even the gun's up over the level. You'll be in a full defilade position, but the tank commander will be standing up. His head, line of sight is above it. As soon as he wants the tank to pull up, boom, they just pull up the rise a little bit, and boom, they're ready to fire. So that's what happens here, and they quickly knock out every tank of the 6, 7. The estimate was 6 to 8 tanks. Radio communication between the 2 Panzer companies is very poor. All right, so now, but the members of the 7th Company know something's awry with the 6th. Big loss of command and control. They start scurrying around. They too expose themselves, and then Kingsley basically takes out that unit. So I'm going to read from my from my book. And keep in mind, during this time, the 19th Tactical Air Command was in action too. So the Air Force air elements, P-47s, have been coming in and doing some damage here as well before this point. And let's see. There was I write about this in my book. There's an amazing amount of history because the correspondent Martha Gellhorn was present in the room where the traffic controller was talking, the radio communication with the planes, with the P-47s that were in action at this time. And I've included a lot of those quotes and things from that actual dialogue when they were taking out the tanks. But let me go to the part about Kingsley. So these are my words. After they've been knocking out the tanks. He says, of course, the Americans knew exactly where the Panzer Company was. Kingsley's 6 Shermans dealt with the second group, that is the 7th Company, just as they had the first. As Kingsley's scorecard crossed the double-digit mark, An elated Delk Odin, who was the commander of the 35th, announced over the open channel to Kingsley that he had just earned a battlefield commission to the rank of captain. Later, as Kingsley celebrated his success, he said, "If that German tank company commander isn't dead, I wish they would make him a battalion commander. I wish they were all that dumb." With all due respect to the opposition. But this was a situation where the 4th Armored, which was such a veteran unit, so well established. I mean, this was right in their wheelhouse. Shades of Aracourt, really.
Yeah.
In terms of, Aracourt was famously the work of the 37th Tank Battalion in many respects. I often thought, I love to tell this story about the 35th and B Company in particular, because that was their Aracourt, where they were through their superior training, just with 75 millimeters. Now, granted, they weren't shooting up Panthers here; they're shooting up Mark IVs, but they completely outwitted and outfought their opponents. Interestingly, with the 7th Panzer Company, there were only 2 men killed in action, despite having virtually all of their tanks knocked out. They limped back, had to abandon their vehicles, got back. There's always some tanks in for repair or other things. So they were instructed to participate in the battle the next day, because it didn't end there. As bad of a licking as the Germans got on that occasion, they were supposed to continue the attack the next day. So the 167th Volksgrenadier Division went on back on the attack, elements of the 5th Parachute Division. And they were able to put together two Mark IVs and 1 Panther to try to support them. And basically the attack went nowhere. I think the Panther and one of the Mark IVs was knocked out right away, and they gave up the ghost at that point. Just decided better part of valor was to pull back. I'd be remiss too if I didn't mention about Kampfgruppe Hansen, because their attack led them directly into the positions of the 35th Infantry Division. Very heavy fighting at Villers-la-Banue, and 2 companies of American infantry had to surrender there. They were overwhelmed, especially with the Mark VI Tigers that came through. And they continued to push through to the west. They didn't make it as far as the M4 highway, but in fact, these are some images from the area, by the way. This is very much near the area where Kingsley's B Company waited for the Germans. And you can see the little bit of elevation in the ground. This is in a similar area, the gap between the 2 woods. That's a well-known photograph. This is another photograph days later from the same spot. The giveaway here is the M4A3E8, the EZ8 Sherman in the front, hadn't arrived yet with the battalion on the 30th. So this was taken days later, and as evidenced by the very severe snowfall too that happened later. But here's what I wanted to get to. This is the Chateau de Losange, which is closer to N4. It's on the west side of the highway, and the larger structure is actually not the chateau. The chateau is the seemingly smaller structure a little bit to the right of that looks like it's almost on a cement pad in this photo. So that the capture of that chateau, originally by the 51st Armored Infantry Battalion several days before, was a very heavy battle. It's surrounded by woods. That clearing just to the north, north is up in this photo, ends shortly above where this photo cuts off, and it's a wood line there. So it's this estate grounds. So it's big open area above it, woods, dense woods to the west, to the east, and then eventually to the north. So very heavy fighting to capture it. And then during the attack on the 30th, as the Germans pushed through the woods, they pushed the elements of the 35th Infantry Division back towards this chateau, which is where the 51st Armored Infantry Battalion had its battalion headquarters. And then a heavy fight took place. And this is an after the battle picture of the chateau. So you can see what type of fire it came under both stages of the battle, the original capture and then the fighting that took place on December 31st, December 30th. A few tanks from the 35th Tank Battalion also arrived on the scene on the 30th to help defend the chateau. But the primary defense was with the elements of the headquarters company of the 53rd at the chateau, with a lot of 50 calibers trained on the wood line. That was the primary defense. And here, I pulled this off of Google Street View. This is the chateau today, which apparently I have not had the chance to visit it, but apparently it was a beautiful estate. I'm not sure if it's used for rental or what the purpose is, but it's restored to its pre-war beauty. That photo is from that road that is actually south of the chateau. So a postscript to all this is after during the Malmedy trial, there were 6 members of the 7th Company that were sentenced to death and 1 member that was sentenced to 10 years. And these were men from rank of squad leader up to captain, the highest level. And they were among 73 that were guilty of war crimes. I don't believe any of those, to my knowledge, I don't believe any of those sentences were carried out. I think, like Piper's, they were all remitted. But fascinating, by the way, and again, the history of the Malmedy massacre and the trials aren't one of my key areas of focus. But even as I was preparing for the talk today and refreshing myself on some things, the memoirs from the 7th Panzer Company are very interesting in terms of how it talks about their interrogations and the eventual trial and the role that some of the members of their company played. So for those interested that really want to develop an understanding of both sides of the hill, it's fascinating reading. I'd recommend it. And this is where this is my last slide. This is just to show people a picture of what things were like, at least on January 1st. This is the situation map from the 12th Army Group. And they were always prepared at noon. And so this is how, at the time, Allied Command saw the situation. And what I always found interesting with this is that is looking at how far west they still have the German salient.
Mm.
And now you can see where they've placed the, they've given attribution for the German divisions, the 9th Panzer, for example, Panzer Lehr. I think it's I have a hard time reading it, the division that's in between there. But yeah, it doesn't quite reflect what certainly some of the reality was. And perhaps, again, this is, at the time, if you've not sort of maybe thoroughly reconned the area where the 2nd Panzer, or the 2nd Armored Division, in fact, you can see even on this map how the 2nd Armored has been shifted. It's already moved and making way for where the British forces, where the, 30th Corps, if I recall?
I think 30th Corps, yeah. I mean, but it does beg that general question of at what point do you switch the label on the map from German to US? Because there are pockets, there are stragglers, there are bits you haven't got your own troops into yet. Because as you said earlier, with a road, what does a road being open mean? Does that mean there are troops stationed along every yard of that road on both sides defending it? Or does it mean that traffic has been going up that road and is continuing to use that road? I mean, this is what basically coming back to what we were saying at the beginning of this transitional period where it's not quite sorted out yet. No, neither side is completely. The Germans haven't quite thrown in the towel yet, and the Americans haven't quite got a solid picture of where they are and what's happening next.
Yep. And then and going in the days to come after January 1. Of course, the Germans still have not given up on the idea of seizing it, because now you move into a phase where the 6th Armored Division has moved into position to the left of the 4th Armored. So the 6th Armored comes into place with the 101st Airborne to its northwest, the 4th Armored Division, and the 35th Infantry Division below it. And now the onus is on the 6th Armored Division to continue the attack. You know, and a lot of course, most people know about the link up between the 1st Army and the 3rd Army at Hufvudstaden. I'm sorry if I'm butchering pronunciations here, but that's January 15th, I think I recall. And and that was the closure. But the objective originally was not to do that. When the 6th Armored Division on actually December 31st began its attack, it was going to the northeast. The objective was to drive towards St. Vith. And there was still a desire to do a better job than the Allied forces ended up doing of cutting off the salient. There never was a cutting off of the salient, despite, well, Patton in particular was one who wanted to cut off the salient. He was denied the opportunity to do that. That was his original proposal. You know, his main interest was not in driving to Bastogne. Keep in mind, you talk about the fog of war. At the time Patton's moving north, Bastogne's not encircled. Bastogne's not cut off until late the day on the, it's not until like really the 21st. That it's Americans are still in St. Vith.
Yeah.
At the time, that this is happening. So people sometimes fail to see the whole context of it. So it's not even a relief of Bastogne mission at the time Patton heads to the Ardennes. It's we're going to attack the south flank of the Bulge. Patton's perspective is he wants to go up at the base of the Bulge and cut it off, and is denied that. Now, frankly, that was probably the right decision because we talk about the terrain and everything else. That would have been no easy task. And I think have not turned out as well as Patton might have liked. But yeah, so many things to come in the battle. And I guess let me just wrap up, Paul, with a thought on the 6th Armored. So the 6th Armored is blunted. It is not able to make that advance. It only goes up a couple of miles. The 4th Armored Division, which has been in that defensive role, gets a little bit of a chance to rest up, but was committed to attack alongside the 6th Armored on January 10th, and still in that northeast direction. So that was still the focus, was advancing, not going due north towards Hufvudstaden. It was to attack towards St. Vith. And then, interestingly, right after launching the attack, they were about 4 hours into the offensive, headed, but heavy resistance. And they hadn't even advanced a mile. And they were pulled out of the line because there was the Allied command was still skittish about the Germans being able to launch an attack farther to the south. Because you had, of course, in the Colmar area, I forget the name of the operation, it's slipping my mind. The other Nordwind operation.
Nordwind. Yeah, I was just going to mention Nordwind. Yeah,
but even separate and apart from Nordwind, they still thought the Germans had the capacity and the intention of launching an attack more to the south, more in the direction of Luxembourg City, and the Allied command was concerned enough about it that they called off the attack, pulled the 4th Armored out of the line, so that they could act in a reserve capacity back in Luxembourg if that attack materialized. And at that point, with the 4th Armored pulled out, the 6th Armored pretty well worn out, it was really at that point where the emphasis shifted a bit. And then the eventual link up on the 15th took place with Hufvudstaden. And from that point forward, this slow, methodical pushing in of the German line. And again, heavy fighting from north to south. I've talked all about the Bastogne area, but when you go back through the recapture of all the battle lines around Malmedy and St. Vith and many of these same units that have been slogging away at it since mid-December, and they're still in the mix late January, recapturing the ground that they originally occupied. So I guess I'll let it go there. And
yeah, well, I mean, brilliant stuff as usual, Don. I've got a couple of points, and it's the main thing I want to address is this idea that some of us still have that the timeline goes relief of Bastogne, skip a few weeks, everything's going well, VE Day. I mean, that's sort of how the timeline goes. If you ignore Nordwind and if you ignore operations Conrad 1, 2, and 3, which are happening in January and February for the relief of Budapest, and then all that stubborn defense the Germans put for the Rhine River itself, the Rhineland generally, Colmar, all that kind of stuff there, and this continued non-stop action that units like the 4th and many other Allied units still face for the next few weeks. This idea that it's all done but the shouting is ridiculous, you know. And so that big fan, and as Trevor Sheehan, Africa and Stalingrad say, and Italy as well. The Germans are still doing stuff there. They're still trying to hold back what has evolved from Bagration, but it's still kind of progressing the Soviet advance. I mean, the Germans are not done yet. They are now the wounded animal who are protecting their cubs, essentially.
And when you think about, and I write about this in my in the second volume to my history of the 4th, which covers from the end of the Battle of the Bulge to the end of the war. And then of course, the whole climate changes dramatically when you're fighting on enemy soil. Not only the determination with which Germans continued to fight, but the civilian population as well. Yeah, because you had a not exactly a welcoming environment, and there was sabotage that then the American forces were trained to guard against, and sometimes in the most pinprick of ways. I mean, in the 4th Armored Divisions, there were things where German citizens came in and tried to put glass bottles under tires. I mean, anything they could do, sugar in gas tanks, and whatever they could do to try to stop their country from being conquered. And it certainly was a 180-degree different experience. For the 4th Armored, they went through this period of advancing across France, being celebrated, flip the switch. It's a totally different situation in Germany. And then when the last 2 days of the war, they advanced into Czechoslovakia, and then they talked about, this is the first time in months that we've seen a welcoming citizenry. Yeah. And it harkened back to those days in France.
Just a quick question for you, because it came up with a couple of shows in recent days. Andy Aitchison, I'm talking about the 52nd Lowland Division, is that you get a sort of a dearth of veterans accounts as you get to the last few weeks of the war, because everybody's just kind of fed up, exhausted, wants to go back home. And where officers were kind of writing big, long, wordy, kind of well-described accounts of the sort of Normandy and September, October, you get to April, everyone's like, yeah, another day, a few guys killed. Did that happen with your research into the 4th?
I would say there was a difference. I think I was fortunate. I was able to get a lot of detail, and then some veterans that I've met personally with enough of a relationship, enough time to talk and get information out. I was able to avoid that. But you know I'll draw a comparison to what you said in another vein. The Army histories themselves, when you go through the green books and and just dealing with Northwest Europe, and you read, the D-Day volume, the cross-channel attack.
Yep.
All right, cross-channel attack. Every logistics, every detail in the world, as rightfully so, to understand the planning and the preparation, the execution of D-Day. And then, if I recall, I think the account, in fairly detailed fashion, goes up to late June. I want to say maybe June 23rd, 24th, and cuts off there. And then you pick up Breakout and Pursuit, Martin Blumensen's volume, and a significant amount of detail. You go to the Lorraine campaign, Hugh Cole's volume, incredible detail. The Battle of the Bulge volume, again, all incredibly detailed. And then you get to the Green Book that covers everything else. One volume, basically, through the end. I take it back. There's two. There's one that deals with the 7th Army, and then you've got the campaign, basically the rest. And it is now granted, the volume of Allied forces in the campaign were far greater. This is one thing, again, a lot of people I think don't appreciate too. When you look at the totality of veterans that served, at least dealing with the American Army in particular, this would be definitely different for the British because of the duration of the war, et cetera. But I don't have the precise numbers, but when you look at the volume of servicemen, a disproportionate amount of them didn't enter the conflict until after the Bulge because of all the buildup waiting for the advance into Germany. So we were still so far short of what was going to be needed to conquer that country, knowing the way it presumably would be defended and so on. So many veterans knew nothing of what happened before, so the sheer number that are in action, and by extension, going back to the writing of the history, when there are so many units, so much area to mine for the historian. I think the net result of that was they sort of, I don't want this to come across like negative for the historians who prepared it, and sort of dumbed it down a little bit. And it's left it to people like myself that have an interest, that recognize there's great history there, and have to go the extra mile to mine it. I would say too, one more point on this. I did find that with many of the battalion records within the fourth, not all, but some, the level of detail that the staff were providing diminished. And I think, this is just my conjecture, I think that's a little bit of fatigue at that point. In the early days, the 10th Armored Infantry Battalion, which has the best battalion diary I've read of any unit in the war. When they first go into the campaign in July, I mean, this every day is down to minutia, and when there's particular combat actions, it's really detailed after action. And then you get into the later stages, and it becomes much less so. And again, I think at that point, it's just like, okay, we've been down this road before, and it just gave it a lot.
I don't suspect at any point people have been coming along from the rear lines, giving big congratulatory thank yous to people for filing good reports. The people have quite rightly been coming up, giving the medals to those who've been, knocking out Panthers with bazookas, and the guy who's been really sorting out his filing and sending off his reports is not going to get much recognition. So towards it as well, why bother? And again, we talked about before going live, that kind of victories in sight. Everybody's now they've got one foot metaphorically on the train back home now. They're kind of thinking, I'm gonna go back to mom's apple pie and sitting on the swing in the garden with my girlfriend, my sweetheart. And you can understand that gradual, well, not gradual, quite speeding up of sense of this is going to come to an end, and it's going to come to an end soon.
Yeah.
Well, Don, we'll leave it there. We've already discussed, folks, Don and I, that maybe another show later, sort of in the springtime, March, discussing some of this very stuff we've been talking about today. But folks, don't forget, tomorrow 2 shows coming your way at 10 o'clock in the morning UK time. We're talking about Reg Seekings, one of the members of one SAS and SRS who's featured heavily in Rogue Heroes, and then it's me in the evening, or depending on where you are in the world, doing some debunking of myths concerning the US Airborne on D-Day. We're going to talk about drownings and the legendary cricket and drop zones, things like that. So I'm looking forward to that. So thank you, Don. Don't forget, check out his Facebook page and his books. Thank you, everybody, for your questions and comments. And as always, consider becoming a member or a patron. But in the meantime, this is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your Monday. Cheers, everybody. Bye.